I gave you a timeline. That's for your own perusal and to look at another later on. It's not important now. It's just gives you a sketch of what's happening in the world, or part of the world, from about the 1100s till 1500. In the olden days, and when I went to high school, we used to do timelines. I wrote down on the board a couple of important names that I'm sure you've heard many, many times, but the dates are not important. I just wanted you to know how to spell these in case you've not run into these names before. Maimonides, I'm sure you all have heard about, and Nachmanides, I'll talk about. Moses Cordovero, these are all great rabbis in the late medieval period. And then some important terms, like the name for Zohar, for the book that Petr will talk about, and the Sefirot are the divine lights. It's too loud, Gene.
It's very bad. No.
Something's going on there with
Oh,
the battery.
What I need is a recorder.
Well, Jean, I'm recording it so you can watch it on YouTube. Yeah. So this still need to go down.
Well, we're recording the whole thing. Gene, can you hear me? I don't know if she can hear me.
I think she got it.
Yeah,
We're recording the whole thing.
Yeah,
Recording.
I can get a copy.
Yes.
It'll be on YouTube.
it will be on YouTube.
Can't you read my lips?
Okay. If you have a cell phone, I hope you turned it off. So, I promised Petr I would make a brief introduction, kind of a thumbnail sketch of Jewish history from the early medieval period until the 1500s or so. Dr. Petr is going to talk about mystical texts and mystical ideas that date back to the beginning of the Torah, the beginning of the Bible, but we don't have time to do 3,000 or 3,500 years of history. I just wanted to focus on important persons and important questions that come up for the Jewish people during this period. Remember that mysticism wasn't invented, so to speak, in the Middle Ages because of a word called Kabbalah. The whole idea of mystical thinking, mystical exploration of the texts was part of the Jewish tradition, at least going back more than 3,000 years. There's so many examples of that. Petr will talk about mystical interpretations in Genesis. We have the story of Ezekiel, the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, with the glimpse of the divine throne, the chariots, and angelic beings that are all part of God's retinue in the heavenly realm. And then we have, of course, the story of the prophet Elijah in the second book of Kings, who, according to tradition, never died, but instead ascended up to heaven in a fiery chariot. So just giving you those 2 or 3 examples is the purpose is to say that mystical ideas and mystical writings and yearnings were part and parcel of Jewish tradition going back prior to 1000 BCE. The word, I'm not going to take questions now. We can do questions later. The word Kabbalah is first mentioned in the late 1200s by Rabbi Nachmanides, Moses ben Nachman, who was one of the greatest Spanish Kabbalists, was chief jurist in Spain in the late 1200s, was involved in disputations with the church authorities in Spain, which almost cost him his life. And he was considered the greatest legal scholar of his generation, of his 40 years as an adult. Nachmanides, though, was seriously interested in Kabbalah and had studied in his earlier days all manner of texts on Kabbalah, and the reason he's known as a Kabbalist is that he wrote a complete Tanakh commentary. He wrote a fairly complete commentary on the Jewish Bible in his later years, when he was in his 50s, which incorporates many ideas and principles of the Kabbalah. So that later, after he passed away in whatever it was, 1270 or something, 1280, he is known as one of the greatest of the early Spanish Kabbalists. You notice on the board the word Kabbalah doesn't mean mystical or esoteric. It comes from the Hebrew word lekabel, the verb to receive, kuf bet lamed. Kabal or kibel means that which is received, meaning the received tradition. So the word Kabbalah, as in modern parlance, in 21st century parlance, is all about mysticism and esoteric thinking, but Kabbalah, as it was understood in the Middle Ages, was considered part of the received tradition. It wasn't outside of the corpus of Jewish thinking. It was right there in the midst of it all. Petr will explain a little more so about the idea that, and we've talked about it in other summer classes, that there are different levels of understanding of the Bible. The fourth level, or so to speak, the deepest level, is understanding or delving into the Bible in what's called the level of sod. In Hebrew, in English, that would be spelled S-O-D. Sounds like sod, but it's pronounced sod in Hebrew. It means the secrets of the Bible. It's the deepest, the innermost core of the onion. And so another day when we're talking about how do we look at the Bible, you'll see that the Kabbalah is really another vehicle for delving deeper and deeper into the inner heart of the Bible, so to speak, the secrets of the Bible. So let me just start with a man named Maimonides to give you an idea of how and why Kabbalah became so important to us in the Middle Ages. By the way, Maimonides, whose father was a famous dayan, a famous judge, he and his family grew up in Cordovero in Spain. Cordovero was considered the Paris of Europe at that time, the most intellectually sophisticated, artistically sophisticated city in all of Europe. Maimonides was considered a genius from a young age. He, in his teens, wrote a commentary on the Jewish calendar. He wrote a treatise on logic before he was 20 years old. In his early 20s, he wrote a treatise, or he wrote a commentary, an explanation of the Mishnah being the core material of the Talmud. All that before he was 23 or 4 years old. I want to kind of frame his life. So what I want to say is, on the surface, he's considered a rationalist. He's considered the greatest, one of the most important codifiers of Jewish thinking over the last 2,000 years. In his deeper levels of his own mind and soul, he was a Kabbalist. In Hebrew, it's called a mikubal. He was a mikubal, someone who accepted the Kabbalah and understood the importance of it. But because he was the public face of Jewish thinking for many, many years as an adult, it seems as though he had to hide his interest in his studies of Kabbalistic thinking, because he was, in a sense, the legal authority for the entire Jewish world, pretty much from the 1170s until he died in the beginning of the 1200s. So here's an example of one of the great problems that the Jewish people faced at the time, which was germane to perhaps why Kabbalah, the mystical way of thinking, flourished and flowered and became more and more important to us. In 1165, a fanatical Muslim sect called the Almohades seized power and took over Spain. There had been, before 1165, in the 1100s, there was a constant battle between the Spanish Catholic authorities and the Muslims. And they were back and forth trying to take control over the Iberian Peninsula. In 1165, the Almohades, this Islamic sect, took over Spain once again. And one of their goals was to convert everyone to Islam. Okay, so what happens to the Jews? Remember, there's a very substantial Jewish community in Spain. They were told you either accept Islam or you die. I mean, this was choice given to them by the authorities. This produced incredible terror among the Jewish community. Many Jews were willing to accept martyrdom, but the majority did not want to die. They wanted to hold on to their faith, and this created a formidable moral problem. How do you maintain your Jewishness when the authorities are telling you you must be a Muslim? So they went to one of the famous rabbis of the day and said, we're in this quandary. We're about to be slaughtered. Can we, in fact, publicly convert to Islam, but secretly practice our Jewish faith in all of its intricacies and all of its ritualistic demands? And the rabbi's reply, we don't know his name, but the rabbi's reply was, no, if you convert to Islam, you forfeit your membership to the Jewish world. It would be a great sin to convert. So he basically gave them an absolute answer. Either you die at the sword, you choose to be a Jew, or if you convert, you're no longer a Jew and there's no path to coming back to Judaism. This was not a dilemma, for a couple of hundred people. We're talking about tens and tens of thousands of people in Spain. Maimonides, at the time, was 30 years old. He was already a famous personality. That's, I guess, a modern description of a person. He was a recognized legal authority. Famous and all that was meaningless back then. Maimonides received the same question from these desperate Jews in Spain. What do we do? And he wrote a letter, which we have complete text of, called the Epistle on Forced Conversion. And what's striking is his own vehemence, his own emotional power that's poured into this letter. It's not, a page or two, it's quite a long treatise. And he says, if you're confronted with this possibility, you have to leave. You've got to get out of the city. You have to leave the country, no matter what it takes, no matter what you have to sell. You've got to leave the country because you don't want to become a Muslim. Travel day and night until you find a place where you can practice your religion. He says also, if you have to choose death, then you have done what is good and proper. In other words, if you have no other choice, you don't have the means to escape, and you have to put your neck to the sword, you will be considered a righteous Jew. But he, contrary to what this other rabbi had answered this community, he says the following: you can publicly convert to Islam as a ruse. You can make yourself a Muslim as long as you promise on your life and on the Torah that you will follow to the full extent of the law Jewish practice. And this was the first important legal scholar to say, in a sense, you can become a crypto Jew. Later on, he was criticized for this, and on and on and on. When you're a genius and you write all kinds of important letters or treatises, people are always going to throw rocks at you. But he was the first significant person to say, better to live than to die, basically. Better to be, you can become a crypto Jew. And I wrote the word down there, anusim, which is the Hebrew word for a crypto Jew. Later on, the term more generally used was Moranos. But the correct term is anusim, people who are secretly practicing. So he gives us this sustained defense of Judaism. In a sense, we see the compassion and the sense of belief in life that he has, rather than focusing simply on legal parameters. By the way, what happens later on around this time, Maimonides finally, he and his family settle in Cairo, in old Cairo, which is a city called Fustat. And there he is practicing medicine, as you know. He becomes the doctor to the vizier, the assistant to Saladin, and thus he becomes one of the great medical practitioners in the city of Cairo, which was a major Jewish population in those days, also contained many important books. He said in one of his letters, I read every book there is known in the intellectual world. I've read every single book on medicine there is. And I've read every single book there is to be known on astrology. How he did all this, it's hard to know. What's important to know is he's dealing with two questions. How do you survive as a Jew in the Muslim world? And if you have to become a Muslim, how do you maintain your Jewishness and still keep your life? He would rather the community practice Judaism, obviously, but he knows that there's a whole section, there's a whole group of Jews throughout the North Africa, in Yemen, which was a major Jewish community back then, and other places who had become secret Jews. So he's dealing with these questions. By the way, it's not pertinent to Maimonides, but thinking about Nachmanides, who lived 50, 60 years later. We went through a lot of plagues in those days. Nachmanides, who was the greatest Spanish commentator, as I said, in his generation, died from the plague. He went to Israel, he went to Palestine in his latter years, and there he passes away. Why did Maimonides also went to Israel, but only for a very short time, because it was a very inhospitable. Jerusalem was a relatively unprotected, dangerous little city, not a hospitable place where there was a potential yeshiva or thriving Jewish community. So it was much more fortuitous for he and his family to move to Cairo and live out their lives in Cairo. So what happens in the 1200s? What I didn't add into this timeline is, in the beginning of the 1200s, after Maimonides dies, are a series of very public and significant controversies. They're called the Maimonist controversies. So many great scholars, particularly in Europe, in different cities, in Amsterdam, in Belgium, in Holland, in Italy particularly, other great rabbis throughout Europe were not happy with much of what Maimonides had written, what he had proposed. There were arguments about the idea of resurrection. There were arguments about when the Messiah would come, what was the nature of the Messianic Era. There were questions about Jewish legal practice and so forth and so on. The big question was, the biggest controversy in a broad swath was, why does this great teacher, this great rabbi, think he has the answer to everything? Because in his writings, he basically says, I'm going to give you the answer to every single question you will ever want to know about as a Jew, both practical and philosophical. So we might say he had a certain amount of chutzpah to assume that he could give all those answers. Many other great thinkers, obviously, don't always agree with his answers. And that engenders this Maimonist controversy that rages for 40, 50 years. In fact, some of his famous books were burned, just as in England later on in the 1200s, they burned the Talmud. The Crusaders burned the Talmud. So, in a nutshell, here is this great legal, intellectual political leader for the Jewish people who has a big heart, who cares about human beings, and underneath it all, even though he never writes about it or really speaks about it, he's a mystic also. He knows that this whole world of the Sefirot, the emanations that come from God's divine personality, are real. But as I said, he had reason not to speak about it. So let's go on to, let's talk about for a few moments Maimonides, who agrees to a public disputation with an emissary from the Pope in, what was it, Peter, maybe 1160 or something? Somewhere in the last 10, 15 years of his life, since he is the leading jurist and scholar for the Spanish Jewish community, he is called upon by the church authorities to defend Judaism. He's defending it against a man who, by the way, had once been a Jew who had converted to Catholicism, who knew a lot about Judaism. So fortunately, Maimonides had greater knowledge and basically was defeating this, was winning this public disputation. But winning meant he was going to lose, or he was going to lose his life. So he, at the last moment, kind of stepped away from the controversy and left town, which was probably the smartest thing you could do. Because as I said, the church wasn't interested in winners or losers. They were only interested in winners. But as I said, he's important because this is just before the Great Expulsion, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is 2-3 generations before the expulsion from Spain. He is the leading light of Spanish Jewish intellectuals. And he is, in a sense, like Maimonides. He's the person to whom everyone goes for answers. And to his credit, when he's writing his Bible commentary in his latter years, as I said, he incorporated much of the Kabbalistic theory, much of the Kabbalistic knowledge that he was understood. So Maimonides, as I said, had to deal with this big problem of forced conversion. The next greatest problem, or I think even a bigger problem, for the Jewish people during these centuries was exile, right? The expulsion. So remember in the, I believe in the early 1300s, the Jews of Toledo and Seville were kicked out of their cities. And we know, later on, towards the end of the 1300s, the Jews of Toledo and Seville were expelled from their cities. But as we know from the story of Columbus, in 1492, the king and queen expelled the Jews from Spain. And in 1497, they completed the task. The leader in Portugal expelled the Jews from Portugal, right? So this is the greatest crisis for the Jewish world in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just a matter of being kicked out of your country. It was that many people had become conversos. They had become anusim long before this because of the influence of the Muslims a century or so earlier. So the church knew who was really Jewish and who wasn't, and the church wanted to root out these second-class citizens, these infidels. And some people had the means to leave. Some people left. Some parts of the community left, went to Italy and eventually to Turkey, which is why Turkey became a major center of Jewish life in the next century or two. Many others wound up in prison. Depending on who you read in the history books, tens of thousands of Jews died between 1492 and the early 1500s. So what I want you to understand, it wasn't just a matter of people getting kicked out of their homes and their cities and getting on the road with backpacks, and as we see the refugees in the Middle East traversing lands. This was a mini Holocaust. This was a decimation of perhaps 50 or 100,000 Jewish citizens in Spain and Portugal over a period of 20, 30 years. So this is the next, not only is it a political, social issue, it becomes part of the issue for the Kabbalists, namely, why are we in exile? Why has God pushed us out, so to speak? Why is it that we can never come back to Israel? Why are we dispersed from the Holy Land? This is a major theological question for the Jewish community at this time. And part of the flourishing of Kabbalistic literature is to answer that question. Why have we been driven out? What can we do to not only bring us back to our homeland, but more importantly, what can we do to bring about the end of exile? Which means not just physical, political exile, but spiritual exile. What are these ritualistic practices, or I should say, spiritual practices that we can engage in that will allow us to come back, so to speak, to God and enable the entire community ultimately to come back to God. This is where we hear the term "litaken et haolam." It means to repair the world. We use the general term nowadays, tikkun olam, the fixing up of the world, the repairing of the world. But the repairing of the world for us today is about social issues, social justice, all the question marks and major issues we have today in America. To repair the world in 1492 or in 1550 was about how does the Jewish community spiritually revivify itself, find some kind of spiritual perfection so that maybe, just maybe, the Messianic era will come to us. We will be, because what is one of the great hopes of the Jewish, one tenet of traditional Jewish thinking was that we all are waiting and anticipating the coming of the Messianic era. And the Kabbalists are trying to answer the question, how do we get closer to the Messianic time? How do we perfect our world, spiritually revive ourselves, so that despite the exile, despite all the losses that we've been through, there's something to look forward to. Nowadays, we don't think much about the Messianic world, except if you're a Hasidim or Lubavitch or Satmar or so forth. But if you can imagine living in the world of 1400 or 1500 with the total uncertainty of life every day, to me, I try and just imagine how people would, what threads people would hold on to give them hope for a better future, because the physical, political, social reality, what they're living in, is generally pretty horrible. So, again, Maimonides is an important teacher for the community. Third teacher I want to mention is a man named Moses Cordovero. I want to give you a quick footnote. I was rereading a number of classic histories of the Jews. If you've got time on your hands, this is probably the most beautifully written one-volume history of the Jews, written by Paul Johnson, a Christian, fantastic writer. I think he wrote for the London Times or the Spectator. He was one of the, he was one of the great writers in England in the late 1900s. And he wrote The History of the Jews, which is just a marvelous, beautifully written volume.
Still alive?
Yeah.
He's still alive?
Yeah, he's in his late 80s, I believe. And I kept thinking, well, what are Jews doing during all these centuries when Kabbalah is flourishing? And the question is, the answer is, nobody really talks about things like senators, congressmen, legislation, social movements in the country, et cetera, et cetera. what the historians talk about are the great rabbis, the great teachers of different generations who were doing their thing. Because Jews weren't interested in history. They were basically interested in staying alive. And what was significant in the Jewish world was that we had so many incredibly brilliant teachers in every 20, 30, 40-year period who, so to speak, uplifted the community and had ways of expounding traditional Jewish ideas and giving people hope. And the Kabbalah is a vehicle for giving people hope. I don't want to say too much because this is Petr's expertise, but in the late 1200s, you see on your timeline I wrote, Moses de Leon writes a mystical midrash, it's in the middle of this line, called the Zohar. He writes this series of manuscripts. It wasn't a book. No such thing as a book in those days, obviously. It was a series of manuscripts, really commentaries on many, many books of the Hebrew Bible. It's written in Aramaic. He never admitted that he wrote this series of manuscripts because it was much better, for many reasons, it was much more important for him to say it came to him from the writings of one of the great rabbis of the 2nd century. You know, when in doubt, always point the authorship to someone much more famous and important than yourself, because you never know who's going to come after you in those days. So Moses de Leon completes the writings of the Zohar, or his, what I call a mystical midrash, probably, we don't know exactly when, in the late 1200s, okay? And immediately there are commentaries, once these manuscripts are circulated among the Spanish rabbinic leaders, their commentaries are written about the Zohar, because it wasn't a complete commentary on everything in the Bible. There were he picked certain books to focus on. Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, some of the books in the prophets and so forth. So others added on to the Zohar. The Zohar, by the way, could be translated as luminous or light-filled. It comes from the idea that every human being has a little spark of the divine light embedded in our souls. And the crux of that book is taken from ideas that have been circulating for hundreds of years prior to Moses de Leon's writings, and it's all about these 10 Sefirot, these 10 divine lights. Some scholars call them divine attributes. These are 10 divine lights, which are, so to speak, a reflection of the divine personality that emanates or jumps into our universe. Anyway, I'll let Petr talk. Petr will tell you much more about all that. Okay, last person I want to mention in the next 4 or 5 minutes, and then this is really Petr's class. So we have these major questions. How to survive if you're living in Muslim rule and you're a second-class citizen and you still want to be Jewish? How do we survive in general because we're in exile? And the third question is, really, how do we bring about the redemption of the world, the Messianic Era? I already mentioned it. Okay, a man named Moses Cordovero, who lived in the middle 1500s, died in 1575, give or take a few years. Every book I read had a different date for when he passed away, but he's a Spanish rabbi who happened to have two of the greatest teachers of the day as his personal students, his personal tutors. Remember, if you were smart enough and you were from an intellectual family and you were lucky enough, some other significant teacher would become your tutor. His tutors, Moses Cordovero's tutors, were a man named Joseph Caro, who became the greatest legal scholar of the 1500s and wrote the book called the Shulchan Aruch, the most famous legal text of the Middle Ages. So he had this genius named Joseph Caro, also was a Spanish Kabbalist. And he has another man named Alcabetz, Rabbi Alcabetz, also his tutor. Alcabetz wrote the song Lecha Dodi, the beautiful song that we sing every Friday night. Alcabetz did more than write a few songs. He was one of the famous mystical writers who was, along with Isaac Luria, these were men living in Safat in northern Israel in the 1550s, 1560s, 1570s, and their leader was a man named Luria. So as you know, you've probably heard this before, this is where some of these great ideas about Kabbalah crystallized in the sermons and the preachings of Luria and Alcabetz and Cordovero, because Cordovero was an eminent scholar and teacher in and of himself. He lived exactly at the same time as Isaac Luria. But nowadays, if you look in a textbook about what is the Kabbalah, they will often call it the Lurianic Kabbalah. Not that Luria wrote a book and with his name on it from Random House saying this is the Kabbalah, because he never wrote anything really. His associate rabbis, his friends, wrote everything down that he spoke. But the ideas and the crystallization of those great ideas about the mystical, lifting people up from the lower levels to the higher levels and bringing God from way beyond down into our universe, this was all part of the Lurianic Kabbalah. Cordovero is important because, in a sense, he's a mouthpiece for Luria. He's one of the great speakers or teachers of Luria's ideas, and he is an expert on Zohar. By the time we get to the 1500s, the Zohar is already 200 plus years old, right, as a book, and it's been circulated all over Europe and the Middle East. People know about it, but there are more and more and more commentaries about it. The Zohar is sometimes called this Holy Zohar because it becomes so powerful and so famous as a series of little books that it's compared to the holiness of the Bible. So Cordovero is important because as a Spanish Kabbalistic teacher, he writes detailed commentaries on the Zohar. He's explaining the Zohar. And what is he trying to explain? He's trying to create or chart a moral code for each and every person. He's trying to explain how we should live our lives in the best possible moral way in order to understand God's attributes, in order to lift up our souls to become closer to God. And as I mentioned earlier, if we can do all of that, and there's a lot of ritual practice, meditational practice, ascetic practice, if we can do that, we may in fact begin to repair the world and hasten the Messianic redemption. So Cordovero, that's why I mentioned him. He's one of the great teachers. Last comment, by the 1500s, there are no Jews in Spain, no Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, right? But Jews are flourishing in many other places around the world. And many Jews, many conversos or crypto Jews have come to Mexico, and it was called, in those days, New Spain, which encompassed half of Texas and all of New Mexico, which is why, if we go back, if we could date back, if we could trace the genealogical heritage of so many Spanish Catholic families here who claim that they're 400 plus years old in terms of being in New Mexico, they were all Jews. They were all crypto Jews. So one of the famous crypto Jews who came to New Spain, who came to Mexico in the 1500s, was a man named Luis de Carvajal, who was appointed by the Spanish Catholic authorities to be the Governor General of New Spain. He was the political leader for Mexico and New Mexico. And he was, until a certain time in his life, he was known as a good Catholic. But he was a crypto Jew. He was another brilliant guy who had climbed up the, political ladder, and he comes to New Spain. He comes over here, and he's the governor general. And then somebody finally discovers or digs it up, investigates, and discovers he's really Jewish. And they drag him out of Mexico City, or whatever the city was, whatever it was called in those days. This is like 1550s, 1560s. They drag him back to face the Inquisition and its court in Spain. And ultimately he dies. I mean, he is put to death. Oh, sorry. No.
That isn't yours.
Repeat his name.
His name is Luis. Yeah, okay, I didn't write it on the board. Luis, I think this is Carvajal. Caravahal. Luis de Carvajal. So he's just a well-known political person in the middle 1500s, in the time when Cordovero is busy, and all of these Kabbalists are busy, right, living and teaching in Sefirot in northern Israel. But it's just an example of how pervasive the crypto-Jewish community had become, and how they had, the really smart ones figured out a way to climb up the Spanish church ecclesiastical hierarchy to gain power and authority in the Spanish world. But unfortunately, Carvajal, his life ended in a disaster because of the church. So, welcome, Petr. Thank you so much for teaching this summer, and it's all yours.
So first of all, I thank to Rabbi Martin for beautiful introduction. And of course, I appreciate all of you who came here. Now, why did you come? Somebody wants to tell me? Why not? That's good. No. If you don't, yes?
To further our search on our return to God.
Okay, I will tell you, if you don't know it, I will tell you why you have come, okay? Because of all of you want to do whatever is necessary to get closer to God. Is that true? Somebody agrees with that? Please raise your hand. Yeah. Okay, so I am glad now you know clearly why you have come. Okay, since it is Kabbalistic session, I will start basically with Kabbalistic invocation, which is not exactly prayer, but it is invitation to angels and other spiritual entities in the universe to come and join us. How they join us? You may notice that suddenly some thought arises in your head, unexpectedly, and you did not plan to produce that thought. It comes from outside. And that's basically how angels and other spiritual entities affect our life, how they can lead us by increasing our intuition. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to gather together, to draw together, to form a vessel, to catch the dew of heaven. If it be thy will, may the veil of heaven be drawn back, and may your Ruach HaKodesh descend upon us, so that we may know your presence. Lord, from thee comes all light. Lord, from thee comes all love. Lord, from thee comes all grace. So be it. Amen.
Amen.
I am glad Rabbi put here several names and several dates. Of course, he put it, let us say, Moses Maimonides, important for conversion, political decision at his time, what to do. But Moses Maimonides was much more important through his spiritual, through his religious, theological teaching. And most of that teaching has been rejected by his current rabbinic Jewish establishment. Only few things from spiritual side were accepted, like one of teaching of Maimonides, which was very outrageous in his time, was his claim that God does not have hands, God does not have a face, he does not have legs. He is not at all like a human being. He is a highly abstract creature, which we cannot imagine what he is, which we cannot understand what he is. And that's one of Maimonides' teaching which was generally accepted. But he made other very important contributions to what later became Kabbalah. One of those was that human person is basically a soul, not his body. And at the final state, after Messianic time, will be pure state of the soul, without body, without physical body. And that's one thing which was rejected by leaders of Jewish community at his time, especially by Maimonides. You know that most of Jews at that time, I don't know, maybe even today, believed that when Messiah comes, there will be resurrection of the bodies, all graves will open, bodies will come out, and Jews who are buried outside of Jerusalem will roll under the earth until they reach Jerusalem. So Maimonides' idea was a revolutionary idea in his day, when he said there may be some resurrection for some time, maybe soul will be reconnected to body, but final state of soul is purely spiritual state, without any physical body. So there's one thing which Maimonides basically brought, and later it was accepted by Kabbalah as well as by Zohar. Another revolutionary thing which Maimonides introduced is his teaching about prophecy. He said each human being is able to modify his behavior, to purify his behavior, to purify his thoughts. And more he does that, he becomes closer and closer to God. And then one state, he will reach state of Ruach HaKodesh, that this divine inspiration will come to him, and he will be able to say things which he even did not know before, which suddenly comes to him. And even more, when he reaches high level of this purification, then he really can become even a prophet. And Maimonides said, in our time, in his time, we had many very, very knowledgeable rabbis, very high scholar of Torah. And he said, and people are wondering why they don't prophesy. And he himself suggested an answer. He said, they think too much about sex. That's why they cannot reach any high state and approach the prophecy. Again, of course, it was rejected by, especially again by Maimonides, who said, our great rabbi, he did not name Maimonides, but everybody understood. Then he said, our great rabbi is again wrong, because we should enjoy all what God gave us. We should enjoy all what God provided to us. Of course, he himself liked many things, so he would not propagate something which would mean for him to make radical changes in his life. Another radical opinion of Maimonides was on sacrifices. I suspect that many of you wondered why Jews were killing animals and doing all these sacrifices, right? And they are very detailed described in Torah. In several books of Torah, we learn with great detail how to do sacrifices. And Maimonides come with suggestion that really they don't have deep spiritual meaning. His suggestion was that, other nations around Jews, they were doing very similar sacrifices. They were killing animals to their own gods, to various entities. And God knew that he cannot tell people just abolish what you have doing for generations. People would not be able to accept it. Because of that, Maimonides tried to redirect the meaning of those sacrifices. God decided, according to Maimonides, to let people continue doing what they were used to do. Just change purpose of that. Instead of paying tribute to other gods, he tried to redirect their attention to pay attention and make a tribute to Yud He Vav He, to Jewish God, to creation of the universe. So Maimonides said basically these sacrifices, even now, he said, are partially to give a bribe to these other gods and to various negative spiritual entities in the universe, to pacify them. And second part of sacrifices was sacrifices to God, to creation of the universe. So that was again something which rabbi of his time basically rejected, right? Because they wanted to continue what they were used to do sacrifices, and then when temple was destroyed, basically replace them by prayers. But they wanted to keep this memory of sacrifices or history of sacrifices a spiritually important part of Jewish life. And Maimonides said, no, it is not so. Another not important but interesting thought by Maimonides was concerning to Shabbat. We say that Shabbat day is holy, and even Kabbalists teach that there is double spirit available during Shabbat, so that we have larger chance to get spiritually inspired. But Maimonides said it's partially true. But he said, why is Shabbat holy day? He said, not because Shabbat has some intrinsic holiness in it. It is holy day because million Jews worship God in that time, on that day. And that makes Shabbat holy. He said, if all Jews would decide to praise God on Wednesday, then Wednesday would be a holy day. So basically it is a holy day because Jews make it holy. So these are few basically of thoughts of Maimonides, which according to my assessment, are very important on a spiritual level. And I have to say that most of those were rejected, and even today, probably considerable part of rabbis and considerable part of Jews reject those ideas, which I believe are very valuable and very helpful. So, some questions concerning Maimonides. No, okay. Maimonides, he had a brother. His name was David. And David was businessman. He was buying and selling diamonds. So he was diamond merchant. And he basically supported Maimonides from early childhood continuously, that he could devote his time to spiritual and religious things, that he did not have to take care how to make living. But then, when they were in Cairo, unfortunately, David was on a ship going to India to get supply of diamonds, and there was, they call, I believe, hurricane, they call typhoons in Indian Ocean, and ship went down and David died. And now Maimonides was in charge of supporting all his family. So then Maimonides looked into himself what he can do, and he decided for this career of medical doctor. So then he worked, I don't know how many hours, at the palace of Sultan, and after that he was seeing Jewish people and teaching, etc. So he probably worked, I assume, 16 hours a day or close to that. And he lived about 4 miles from the ruler of the Muslim world. And I don't know how fast you can travel 4 miles on a donkey. So he was each day traveling forth and back on a donkey, which probably take him close to an hour, I suspect. So there was Maimonides from the point of view of Kabbalah. And even some today so-called Kabbalists are speaking against Maimonides, and they call him rationalist, because Maimonides tried to explain many things which are in Torah by logic, by using his brain, use knowledge, his knowledge of logic, of astronomy, of physics, etc. And he tried to remove superstition from the Jewish religion. By the way, Maimonides also said, if somebody wants to study the spiritual things, he should spend 2 years before that to study sciences, physics, mathematics, astronomy, and logic. Well, I would say that it would be useful even today as prerequisite of any spiritual teaching, basically, to understand the physical world first before you go to higher levels. I mentioned Maimonides. I believe Rabbi spent quite a few times on Maimonides. I myself basically don't feel great appreciation for Maimonides because he was one of major critic of Maimonides. And I believe that many things which Maimonides understood from spiritual point of view, Maimonides was not able to understand, and because of that he was against Maimonides. He was, of course, great scholar of Torah, Jewish law, etc., etc. And also he was familiar with Kabbalah. But in his books, in his commentary on Torah, he is using Kabbalah in very hidden way, really, not openly. So, Maimonides died 1270, and about 1280, it is first time that little brochures appeared among the people, and it was first installment of Zohar. Zohar was made available in several installments when Moses de Leon was selling copies of several pages, maybe 100 pages of Zohar. We already heard that, who wrote Zohar? Of course, Zohar has clearly thoughts accepted by Maimonides and works on them. So my personal opinion is that it was really written in 13th century by Moses de Leon, but not only by him. He was kind of leader of Kabbalistic circle. He had like about 10 people, 10 rabbis around him. They were meeting probably at least once a week to discuss various topics of Torah. And either de Leon himself or some of his fellows helping him make basically notes of these discussions. And I believe Zohar is a commentary on Torah, but it is basically, I would say, a collection of discussion which this small group of Kabbalists had at his time. Of course, Orthodox rabbi, even today, believe that Zohar was really written in 2nd century of Common Era by Shimon ben Yochai. Shimon ben Yochai was one of the students of Rabbi Akiva, and when there was uprising, second uprising of Jews against Roman, led by Bar Kokhba, right? and around the year 135 or around in that area. They were originally successful. They existed. They have their own area, barricaded against Romans, and they printed their own coins, you know, counting new era, starting when Bar Korba arrived, started. It was year 1, then year 2, year 3, etc. So introduced new counting of years, everything. And we know that now Rabbi Akiva was a person with great achievement. He was born in poor family. First 40 years he spent as a shepherd working for some owner of the land. And then somehow he got involved in daughter of that owner, and they wanted to get married. Of course, this future father-in-law told him, you have to study first before you can marry my daughter. And they provided him means how to do it. So Rabbi Akiva starting his study, and from the year 40 to year 80, he was like student of Torah, and probably beginning of Talmud at that time. And finally, at the year 80, from 80 to 120, he lived till the year 120. He started to teach, and he had like 10,000 of students. But why I mention Rabbi Akiva, he was mentor, basically guru, I would say, of Moses, of Shimon Bar Yochai. But the fact that he supported the uprising, and that he even supported the idea that the leader of that uprising is Messiah, it shows that even highly evolved spiritual being can make grave mistakes. Because of that, 1,000, maybe 10,000, maybe more of Jews were killed by Romans because of this uprising. And Akiva was one of the strongest supporters of that uprising. And his claim that the person, the leader, is Messiah, you know, it's really confused many of Jews. And Shimon Bar Yochai, at that time, he also would be killed by Romans, but according to tradition, whether it is true or not, I don't know, he hid in the cave. He and his son Elizar lived in the cave for 13 years. And story goes that during those 13 years, he wrote down Zohar. That God basically channels through him Zohar. So that's one story. And I found that at least few Orthodox rabbis believe that it is true, that that's how Zohar was written. While most of Reform rabbis, they accept basically scientific results suggesting that Zohar was really written in 13th century by Moses de Leon and his group of students of Kabbalah. Now, I still would say something, you know. Zohar was really neglected very much through century. I think after Safed, up to years about 1900, nobody read Zohar really. And I believe the main reason is because again, Jewish rabbi did not feel great love for Zohar. Now, why they would not feel great love? Well, Zohar agrees with Maimonides. Zohar said, the man, the human being, is basically the soul. That's what human being is. This physical body is just dress, like a coat which we put on. And therefore, and soul has only one desire. Soul was created at the beginning of creation, from the area where God was. And even God puts little tiny piece of himself in each human being. And that's why we call basically human beings. And so, as you know, Rabbinic Judaism, according to my understanding, teaches that man is dual quantity, that it is basically composition of physical body and immaterial soul, and that both are important and both will be kind of resurrected and live together forever and ever. While Zohar basically strongly disagree with that and said it is soul of man which is important. But we have to pay attention, not to physical body. Physical body, we have to learn how to govern it, to make sure that physical body does not govern us, our behavior, that we govern physical body. But in the final state of evolution, it is just soul will return to higher world, close to God, and then it will live whatever, whether forever and ever or less time, I don't know. Second idea, which is completely different in Zohar, is idea of God. What is God? Most of Jews at that time, they imagined that man is made in the image of God. So God somehow will look like we do. And Zohar said, no. He came to the idea of God as something which is infinite, which we can never understand. And, let me tell you, you see some human being. Can you see his soul? No, you don't see his soul. But can you learn something about his soul? What you have to do? You have to observe his behavior, what he does. And from this, you can make backward some deduction about state of his soul, right? If person is, let us say, very rough person, argue with everybody, beat up people, it tells you something about his soul. And if person is very considerable of everybody around him, try to help to everyone, it tells you again something about his soul. So Zohar said, and the same is about the God. You cannot see soul of the person, but from action you can deduce something about him, about his soul. Similarly, you cannot see God, but from his actions, from his creation, you can deduce something about God. So Zohar claims God is infinite. You can never learn about him. Nobody can talk to face to God. Why? Because God does not have any face. But by looking how God manifests himself in this creation, you can deduce few things about him. Okay, and so Zohar says we cannot see God, we never can see God, but we can learn something about God from the way he manifests in this physical world. How he manifests? He manifests to us through this system, Kabbalistic system of Sefirot. Sefirot is plural from the word Sephirah, and each circle on this graph is called Sephirah. I will be talking later, explaining each, Sephirah, what is its meaning, etc. But Zohar said, yes, man was made in the image of God. But it does not mean physical body. It means human soul is made in similar way as this diagram, which is called Etz Chaim in Hebrew, or tree of life in English. So he said, this is image how we see God manifestation in this world. And this is also image how soul of man is made, how it is composed of different qualities. So these are two things basically, that man is basically soul and his body is a junk which he will put away as soon as body dies, and then sometimes later he will do reincarnation and soul will be reincarnated into different bodies. And this process goes on and on until the soul reaches perfection. In each incarnation, human soul is supposed to be better and better. Now, what is available to us, what we can affect in this life, is lower part of this tree, the lower Sefirot. The upper three Sefirot are not accessible to us. We cannot get there through our effort only. To get there, we need combination of our effort and grace of God. And these two, without our effort, however, the grace can never come. This again, one of basic teaching of Zohar is any spiritual progress has to start with us. If there is desire from below, only then can help from above come. help from above can never come if there is no desire from below. So we have to move in our soul from lower Sefirot to higher, and then if we are worthy of it, if our life is really purified, our thoughts are completely pure, then eventually grace of God can come. Now, Kabbalah is a mixture of intellectual study, that basically what we are doing, of meditation. Purpose of meditation is to get us control over our thoughts, to put our thoughts apart and try how to bypass our thoughts. And the last part is basically modification of our life, which is the most important. But of course, we cannot do modification unless we understand the structure of whole universe, structure of soul, how soul can improve itself. So because of that, we need this intellectual study first. And then come second part, meditation. So we will do some simple meditation first. You know, meditation was for 1,000 years part of Jewish practices. According to stories, like 1,000 years before BC, 1500 BC, there were this school of prophets, where very gifted Jewish children were taught from early beginning Torah, spiritual knowledge, meditation, and all those practices. Of course, those practices are very similar to practices of our tradition, especially of Eastern religions, right? Maybe some of you did Buddhist meditation or Hindu meditation, etc. So you know mantra. Mantra is repetition of the word over and over. So we will do mantra composed of 2 syllables. First will be Ya, Ya, Yud, and He. If you know a little bit of Hebrew, that is Ya. You know, it is first part of a name of God for tetragrammaton, right? Ya. And second part will be Hu. Hu means in Hebrew, He, right? So Ya and Hu can be translated loosely like He is Yah, or Yah is He. So what we will do it whispering only, not chanting loud, but whispering, not just thinking. You know, Hebrew gives quite emphasis on forming the sound. He said forming sound is important. Meditation is not so powerful if you just think the mantra. You have to pronounce it, either loud or at least in whisper. So as we will breathe in, we will whisper to ourselves, Ya. And as we breathe out, Hu. Ya. Hu. Ya. Hu. So you can do it at your own pace, but whisper yourself, Ya and Hu. You can close your eyes if you wish. Okay, now we add a little bit, one more element to the same meditation. You can imagine that this is our head, composed of these top 3 Sefirot. And here, intersection of this line connected these 2 blue Sefirot with vertical line going down from top Sefirot. This point here is roughly in the middle of your forehead. Eastern religion call it third eye, but it is just intersection of these 2 lines here. And this point is middle of your forehead. So we will do the same meditation again, Yah and Hu, but we will put our concentration at this point in middle of our forehead. Okay? So let us do it again just for 2 minutes. Thank you. And we'll still add additional element to the same medication. The sound ah, like in ya, in general, any ah is connected to basically to this point in middle of our forehead. It is sound which basically helps us to open these top 3 Sefirot. That sound ah, ya. On the other hand, sound oo, like in hu, is connected to the lowest Sephirah, to Sephirah Malkut. And in our body, this Sephirah is at the end of our spine, okay? At the lowest point of our spine is located Sephirah Malkut. So if we whisper Ya and Hu and Ya and Hu, we are basically trying to open the path between lowest Sephirah and highest Sephirah along our spine. So we will do next modification of this meditation will be, as we say Ya, we concentrate on middle of our forehead, and as we say Hu, we concentrate at the base of our spine. In Kabbalistic teaching, we have basically to bring, we will talk about that later in later lectures. Malkut is considered to be a seed of Shekinah. Shekinah is feminine part of God, which is everywhere in this physical world, and which is in our body is concentrated at the lowest point of the spine. And by this meditation, we are trying to open the path of Shekinah from the lowest part to middle part and to top part. So that's theory of this meditation, Okay, so we will do Ya, concentrating on our forehead, Hu, and you put your concentration on the lowest point of your spine. So again, just for 2 minutes. Ya. Okay, we will make it short. Thank you very much. We end this meditation by that. No, you can try it at home, right? You can try it each day for 15 minutes. If you do it for a year, you will see some changes within your thinking, with your flexibility, etc. Now, Vinny, do you want to play for us some simple meditative song? Just play without our chanting. Can you do it? Okay, so can you please do it?
For chanting that you're going to do?
Right now, yes, here.
Just by itself?
Just by yourself, yes. Or you have somewhere RAAMAK? No. Okay, we still have 5 minutes according to our schedule. So finally I will get to topic of our today's lecture, which is Abraham's journey according to Zohar. So I believe most of you are familiar with Genesis chapter 12, when Genesis said, God said to Abraham, Lech lecha, which means go to yourself, usually translated just as go from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. So that's probably first 2 verses, in my free, not translation, by my free delivery of that. So we all know what it means from our Torah study, right? Abraham originally were living in Ur, And then they moved to Haran with his father Terah. And then finally, God talked to Abraham in Haran, leave your land, father's house, etc. Come with me to the land which I will show you. So it is, in basic reading, it is just motion on this horizontal direction on the surface of the earth from one place to another place. And then God has to promise to Abraham, because it was not easy to move at those times. He promises, I will be important. Because Terah and Abraham started the move from Ur to Haran by their own initiative. They wanted to go to Holy Land themselves, before any order from God. And only when they did it and moved halfway at least to Haran, then God entered it and said, listen, Abraham, now leave your land, leave your father's house, your relatives, and go to the land which I will show you. So it teaches this great universal law that impulse has to come from below before help from above can come. Abraham and Terah, they moved on their own initiative from Ur. They started movement toward Canaan by themselves, and only God helped them. So, and go from, now he's telling, they are in Haran, God is telling them, leave your land, leave everything, and come with me to the land I will show you. But now they are moving in horizontal direction up. They go from the physical world to first spiritual world. We will learn later, it's called Yetzirah, the word of Yetzirah in Kabbalah. So the land which I will show you means higher spiritual world. And this is land which I give you and to your descendant as inheritance. So God is promising him basically upward motion in ladder of spiritual levels to higher and higher level. So that second level of the same story, according to Zohar explained. But now comes the third level. Third level is again in horizontal direction, but in opposite, from top to bottom. You know, we already mentioned that God created all souls at the beginning of creation. He created it from his throne or from himself partially. So now you have the highest spiritual world, and then you have all souls sitting as they were created at the beginning of creation. It says all souls which later will live in physical body were created immediately at the beginning. And then what it means when he said to Abraham, leave your land, your place of birth, your father's house, and come with me to the land I will show you. God is talking now to the soul of Abraham in highest level. And God is telling, leave now this beautiful place which I have created from you, where you were sitting maybe for 1,000 years and enjoy it, and come with me down to the physical world, to the land which I will show you. Now it means to the body which will be formed and which I will show you. come with me from the spiritual level down and incarnate into physical body, which I will show you. This is now the land which I will show you. And it is getting quite late, so I have to probably cut it short. I wanted to show you maybe with more detail this at least 3 levels of understanding which Zohar brings. And in this case of travelers, it is easy to understand 3 levels. Otherwise, Zohar is very confusing, really, very not easy to read, not easy to understand, and even more, Zohar, even it is organized according to Parshas, various topics are discussed in any of these Parshas. Some rabbi mentioned some problem and immediately they discuss, let us say, immortality of the soul. And they discuss it in Parsha which has nothing to do with immortality, or other topics. So Zohar is not organized according to topics, really. It's organized according to Parsha, and you want to learn about, let us say, resurrection and soul after death, it is spread over a long series of Zohar discussions. Now, I want to show you something here. You see, Zohar was published in 16th centuries in original Aramaic. There were several, at least 2 publications in 1500, end of 1500, and then several editions in 1600, etc. But it was not available in the English until 20th century. And within last 40 years, there are 3 editions of Zohar, and I own at least part of all 3. This is Zohar as it is latest edition, published in completion about 2 years ago. That's Daniel Matt, who translated Zohar from original Aramaic. And it is 12 volumes like this. Stories which are difficult to read, difficult to understand, impossible to connect to others, etc. So it's really work for biblical scholars, I would say. Before that, shortly before the beginning of 2000, was published Zohar like this. It is Zohar which was translated from Aramaic to Hebrew in about 1930 by Rabbi Ashlang, who was contemporary of Rabbi Kook in Jerusalem. He translated into Hebrew, and then Rabbi Berg in 1900 translated from Hebrew to English. And this is in 25 volumes like that, because it has both English and Aramaic. So it is 25 volumes, and both are, not easy to read. But what I found very, very helpful is Wisdom of Zohar, published by Rabbi Tishby in about 1980s. It is in 3 volumes like this, and it is not complete Zohar. It is just selected parts, but fortunately, he put it according to subjects. So if you look into Life of the Soul, you will find section Life of the Soul, and there will be like 20 different sections of Zohar which are spread over these 25 volumes. They will be put together in one place. So because of that, I found it the most helpful, really, Zohar by Tishby. By the way, I didn't buy most of the books. This was gift from to me from people who call Berama, they are good, and the other I got 25 volume again from some friend who in her young years with great enthusiasm bought 25 volume of Zohar, and it was everything packed in, still in original packing, so she never opened it, but finally they donated it to me. So this, I believe we are already 8 o'clock, we are already late, so thank you, Lord, for your blessing, and I hope you have learned something useful today that will help you slowly to modify your life. I have been teaching courses like that in summer now for about 10 years. I think first 6 years in Beit Shalom, and I think last 4 years here. And my goal is always per year to inspire one person at least, that he will make at least little changes in their life according to what they learn in this short series. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much.